Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So right before we started recording, we were talking about last week's episode on Elon Musk. Obviously, a lot has happened since we recorded that episode, so much so that we thought it might be worth delving back into that subject before we move on to this week's topic. And Adam, obviously, since we talked about Musk's influence on the U.S. government has revealed itself to be even more dramatic, I think, than we imagined at the time. I mean, do you think any of our analysis requires a revision? What do you think 1 week later?
Oh, thanks for bringing this up, Cam, because I have to say that, and being in the position of a commentator on affairs in the current moment is a somewhat agonizing business, because the flow of events is so dramatic and so rapid, and the tendency right now is towards escalation. And so, if you do what I think of as being the job of the commentator in trying to contextualize things, and there's a kind of slight bias towards de-dramatization, and then you're confronted with what we've seen on two fronts that I want to come back to, USAID and South Africa. You feel, I really did have remorse to an extent, or like regret about, or a feeling of hangover after doing the episode last week, given the news that followed. The assault on USAID that's the American aid agency, which has a budget of $40 billion. That's 20% of official development assistance worldwide. The destruction of that agency is like nothing we've ever seen in recent history in terms of governmental change. People do austerity-driven reform programs of governments. By the later stages of the Eurozone crisis, Troika inspectors were going into Greek government building and seizing computers and doing all this stuff. But, that took years to get there, and it followed a procedure. And what we're seeing in the US right now is closer to a Jan 6 style occupation of government offices doing what previously were considered to be essential jobs for global development and American soft power and American hegemony, indeed. And I don't think anyone saw coming just how draconian and radical that has been. And I'm so radical that it also, I have come to the conclusion that, I'm in favor of free speech. I despise much of what Elon Musk says, but I don't want to react to that by simply ending my presence on Twitter. But the storm of USAID over the weekend is just too much. So I came to the conclusion over the weekend that any engagement with Twitter in an active way had to stop. So you asked me about what my policy on Twitter was, and I just think this is insupportable. It's absolutely extraordinary, and it will kill people. I was at a meeting last night with a very highly placed American figure who said that, to his knowledge, 5,000 medical staff in Ethiopia had been let go in the last 24 hours. We know there have been threats to the retroviral programs. This is a really devastating assault on a key part of the global development infrastructure. And the best story, and I have heard Democrats extraordinarily, to my mind, like telling this story, USAID was always too independent. The future is that it's going to be incorporated into the State Department. Hillary Clinton would quite like to have done this. Now they're doing it. Well, they're handing it over to Marco Rubio, who has just announced today, that's Thursday, maybe it was overnight, that he's not going to attend the G20 meeting because it's being hosted by South Africa under the sign of the three buzzwords are solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And as far as Rubio's concerned, that's all just a Trojan horse for woke. And his job is to represent American interests, and he can't attend a G20 meeting hosted under that slogan, and certainly not by South Africa, because also in the last couple of days, the Trump administration has picked a huge fight with South Africa over land transfer programs. The government in South Africa, which at this point is a moderate coalition, has decided to continue with the program of black empowerment, which involves righting the historic injustice of apartheid-era inequality in land ownership, and also is driving the black empowerment agenda with regard, amongst other things, to Elon Musk's investments in South Africa and the Starlink hookup, which is actually quite an important extension of Starlink's presence in the world. And Trump has, on the basis of this, threatened to cancel all aid for South Africa. It's about $500 million, which mainly goes to the HIV program, which for 20 years has been one of the bipartisan achievements of US policy. And, I made like a effort to provide what I thought was a more complicated account of Elon Musk's relationship to South Africa. And we don't know that this turn of policy is Musk driven. Trump was aggressive on South African land reform issues in the past administration. But we do know that Trump is surrounded not just by Musk, but a variety of white South African voices. And to be honest, I just, again, didn't see this coming. I don't think anyone saw this coming. It's a huge shock. There's now talk of the United States exiting the G20 altogether because the G20 can't actually meet because it is a representative body of powerful emerging market states. It's very difficult for them to meet if you're not willing to at least go through the motions, engage in the structural hypocrisy of embracing agendas like, solidarity, equality, and sustainability. If that for you is woke, these are woke buzzwords and you have to call their bluff, well, then, this really isn't going to work. And that isn't to say that there isn't some kind of logic in calling the hypocrisy. It's just that is the hypocrisy on the basis of which the global governance system, so-called, has functioned. So this is just an example for me of how it is very hard to get a measure right now of the pace of radicalization. And there is a tendency out there to do this exercise of what's called sane washing, where we make an effort to somehow, describe what the Trump administration is doing in, more reasonable terms. But sometimes really one has to say, that we're witnessing something quite unique, quite extraordinary, and quite devastating and shocking. So anyway, I just wanted to add that ahead of doing another episode about Trump because it's really getting to me. I am having to do this stuff practically every day, and every single day I'm having hangovers and nightmares about things I did and didn't say because the pace of change is just so stark and it is challenging our ability to make sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, this provisional aspect to what we do, not only on this podcast, but journalism in general, obviously, is by its nature provisional. We're trying our best in the moment to understand what is going on. And at times like this, sometimes it's very hard to know what is going on. I think there's a reciprocal aspect to that too, where listeners should keep that in mind as well. We're trying our best, and I think in most cases, that will be the case, that listeners know that. But yeah, and I think actually this week's topic that we wanted to address is a perfect example of that because, we talked about addressing tariffs this week. And at the beginning of the week, the subject looked very different than it does at this point. The data point I ultimately, will flag is 10%, which is the scale of the additional tariffs that have now been imposed on imports to the United States from China.
News. A fresh trade war between the US and China has just kicked off. An hour and a half ago, the US went ahead with its promise of 10% tariffs
on all of Chinese goods went into effect at 12:01 this morning. We saw Beijing immediately retaliate with a barrage of their own measures. But look, this 10%
on US imports, including crude oil, coal, and other goods, to come into effect next Monday. The levies are in response to Washington imposing tariffs on all Chinese
Those
imports.
add upon other tariffs that have been imposed not only during Trump's first term, but during the Biden administration as well. But they come among a flurry of other tariff threats that Trump made and has since postponed against Mexico and Canada. And so we thought we'd try to get a handle on this moving target. And to start off with, aside from the use of these tariffs as a diplomatic kind of threat, which seems to have been the case with Canada and Mexico, it's not clear if there's a real intention to impose those tariffs at all, or just to have used them as leverage. It does seem that there are, advocates for tariffs on the economic merits who have coalesced around Trump in recent years. And those advocates themselves, if you kind of look at what they say, have motivations that it seemed to me that are somewhat in tension with one another. I mean, on one hand, there are kind of industrial policy goals that are kind of focused on building specific industries up in the United States and using tariffs to that effect. And then there are kind of more deep-seated motivations kind of associated with something that some advocates call a bounded market, creating a bounded market in the United States. And that's something I've seen in the writings of Oren Cass, perhaps associated with Robert Lighthizer, the first trade representative from the first Trump term. I'm just curious whether you could describe these philosophies and whether there are, in fact, in tension with one another and how we can kind of understand the various goals at work.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to make them in tension with one another, you could say that one way of thinking about the difference is whether or not you trust yourself to identify winners. Advocates of industrial policy believe that it's incumbent on policy to attempt to pick winners, to identify sectors that matter and to promote them. And you can do that via tariffs. And classically, this would be an infant industry type argument that was widely adopted in the US in the 19th century. So in this country, it has a real historical legacy. It's been widely adopted in the developing world, sometimes very successfully, sometimes less so. The risk, of course, is that if you build an infant industry safety net, if you like, if you build a kindergarten, then the industries never graduate to being really competitive. But if you believe in economies of scale and regional economies and learning by doing and all of that good stuff that Paul Krugman and his generation of trade economists taught us in the 80s and 90s, then you believe in the possibility of seeding economic growth and industrial concentrations and efficiency. We've talked about this in so many different episodes of this show over time, and then you watch it grow. But you really do have to believe in your ability to pick winners, to identify what those sectors are. And you have to believe that the US has the wider infrastructure, whether it's in solar cell manufacturing or in chip manufacturing, to support such a push. And it's a high bar. So that's one line of argument. And that's, I think, really quite bipartisan at this point. The other line of argument is to say, well, I'm not going to make choices. I don't believe I can, or I don't believe I should. But I can say that I think the existing state of things has been rigged to the disfavor of domestic producers over importers of foreign goods and consumers who get those cheap foreign goods, and that reduces their cost of living. And furthermore, I think that this state of affairs systematically rigs the struggle, which I acknowledge, between different, you might call it politely, stakeholders in the capitalist game, or once upon a time we would have called it different classes. It rigs it in favor of capital, which can go anywhere in the world and can employ whoever, against labor. And in an optimal case, this is Oren Cass's argument, when capitalism is good, when we should support it, that struggle between capital and labor is kind of win-win. Businesses have an interest in having highly skilled, highly motivated workforces. And of course, workers have an interest in being paid well and developing their skills. And in win-win situations, he describes it as people being closed in a room and needing to find a bargain. And if you open the room and let other people in, then it becomes much more difficult to broker that bargain. And that's his account of globalization. He thinks of globalization as having fundamentally undermined the conditions for a healthy capitalism. And that is a kind of nice, ironic twist, right? Because everyone who was a kind of committed ideologue of capitalism was in favor of globalization. And he's arguing that really they're in contradiction with each other. And so what you need to do in that case is just shift in general the trade-offs between importers and exporters, between domestic production and foreign production, and create the conditions within the United States or any other society for a better deal between capital and labor. And I think the pushback there would be to say, right, okay, that's a really compelling and quite a nice story. It's just, is that really a reasonable description of what's happened in the United States since, I don't know, take your pick, since the 1960s? When was the last time you thought American capitalism functioned well in a holistic sense? And I think most people looking at the globalization story would say, of course, it's happened. But relatively speaking, America is not a highly globalized society. The entire story is of an increase of 10% of GDP, of, the share of imports in GDP in the United States was 5% in the 1960s, which you would think of as great society, a kind of holistic American capitalism working well for the American middle class as well. And it's now 15%. Right? That's a 10% shift at the same time as America's GDP has grown fivefold. So the redistributional element of that import shock, in so-called, is really it's just not that large, right? The largest, the most dramatic estimates of the so-called China shock are, shall we say, 3 million jobs lost. America's workforce is over 160 million. So we're talking about small percentages. And there may be a demonstration effect, of course. There are certain sectors which have been very badly damaged, certain regions. You could say this spreads fear and changes the terms of the conversation. But I think the pushback has got to be, look, Oren, this is a great argument. This is really, this is smart conservatism, no doubt. But I just don't think the quantitative shift would explain it. If something has gone wrong in the bargain between American capital and American labor, which it surely has, why point the finger at globalization, and why not ask yourselves what domestic policy choices were made in that period, which made globalization, when it happened, as painful as it was, and whether or not the foreign imports and foreign labor in the room at any given moment make a reasonable deal between capital and labor in the United States possible, and particularly, since you are a lifelong supporter of the Republican Party, what the specific role of your partisan allegiance is in shifting, as it undoubtedly has been, the balance of power between those two groups. And are we, in a sense, involved in an ideological obfuscation and diversion in focusing as hard as American discourse right now does on the globalization element? In other words, is this protectionist thing that you're arguing for really just eyewash? It's just window dressing. The fundamental shift in the balance of power, which has happened, you see it in all of the data, is really a domestic story. So that would be the knock on that side of the argument.
Yeah, then I wonder if there's some more clarity brought to bear by what seems to me another group of thinkers who are in support of a tariff regime, namely people like the economist Michael Pettis, perhaps some of the people around Treasury Secretary, the new Treasury Secretary, Bessent, namely this motivation for a rebalancing of investment flows into the United States, using tariffs as part of a system to alter the role and value of the U.S. dollar. I'm curious if you could expand on that strategy and how that lines up with the others that you just described.
Yeah, so this takes off from a really fundamental kind of question in economics, which is, how is it possible that a country sustains a trade deficit, in the American case, over more than half a century? And the deficits began to build up on a large scale in the 1960s, because you would expect that to be adjusted away, right? You'd expect that to be adjusted away by currency movements, because if America is persistently running a trade deficit, it needs lots of foreign currency. It has too much dollars. It will sell the dollars to buy the foreign currency. You would expect the foreign currency to appreciate and the dollar to devalue. And as that happens, the foreign goods become more expensive, less competitive, and American goods become more competitive. And so then you would expect the trade deficit to disappear. Part of the answer, the early historical answer, is under the old Bretton Woods system, that couldn't happen because exchange rates were fixed. But Nixon responded to that between 71 and 73 and blowing the Bretton Woods system up. And since then, currencies have been relatively free to move. So what's going on? And the answer on the part of the Pettis et al. Is two things. First of all, it may be true that the dollar fluctuates against many currencies, but China, for instance, in the late 90s, decided to peg its currency against the dollar and to manipulate the currency so as to keep it low. And that's self-sustaining, because what happens there is China, with a more competitive currency, sells a lot of goods to America. It generates an export surplus that generates a flow of dollars. And to keep your currency low, what you can do is continuously pump your own currency into the market, selling it. There's no inherent constraint on your ability to manipulate your currency down rather than up. If you manipulate your currency up, you need dollars to support your currency. If what you're trying to do is keep your currency down, what you need to be willing to do is accumulate American assets ad nauseam. In the end, trillions of dollars worth of American assets. So what Pettis et al. Say is, okay, in the Chinese case very explicitly, but more generally, the reason why the dollar is not devaluing, driven by the trade deficit in the way that we would expect it to, must be to do with the fact that foreigners are willing to hold dollars, not to buy American goods, because that would stimulate exports, but simply because they want American assets. So they want American equity shares, they want corporate debt, or they want American government debt. And that's the fundamental reason that this imbalance persists, right? America's manufacturing sector, its traded goods sector, is squeezed out, you could say, by foreigners' hunger for another thing which Americans sell to the world, which is shares in the American economic pie. And this happens on an absolutely huge scale. In any given month, it could be between $100 and $140 billion net in terms of foreign accumulation of American assets. And all told, foreigners own about 20% of all US securities, 33% of US treasuries, 27% of corporate debt, and 17% of equities. Why that difference? Because equities fluctuate in value. So they are, if you like, less liquid. You don't know on any given day what you're going to get when you sell them. Whereas US treasuries, which are as good as dollars, you know on any given day pretty much exactly what you're going to get back, which is very near to face value. And so foreign asset holders who want safety and dollar assets and dollar returns hold disproportionately large quantities of US Treasury debt. And while that demand persists, while this demand for financial assets as exports persists, it's really naive to imagine that you can, by trade policy, by making fancier cars, by any particular intervention in any particular market for goods, do much about the underlying deficits that are maintained. And this has two-sided element, like to the extent that China is willing to deliberately manipulate its exchange rate and accumulate these assets, they can do that. And that's where trade policy pressure may help, or direct types of intervention. But in general, so long as the world continues to regard America's assets as safe and desirable, one could continue that thought and say, so long as the dollar remains the hegemonic global currency, this deficit will persist because it's the buying of the assets, which is actually pumping demand into the United States. That then keeps the American demand for imports going, and that props up the dollar, making American goods exports uncompetitive. And no dollar-centered policy per se is going to work on this until you address this underlying demand problem. And to do that, well, then you've really got to consider some pretty wild options, which will be things like levying a tax on foreign acquisitions of American financial assets, which would presumably cause just hell in Wall Street, because Wall Street lives off these transactions, right? Implicitly in this story, there's an argument that the interests of American financial capital, Wall Street, have been prioritized over those of productive capital. American consumers and Wall Street have entered into a bargain by which essentially Wall Street finances large-scale American borrowing from foreigners, because that's what it means when you sell an asset to a foreigner. That's another way of describing this balance. So as allow American consumers to buy cheap foreign goods, which are cheap because the dollar is overvalued. So unraveling this would involve a fundamental shift in the cost of living. It would involve a fundamental shift in the balance of power between Wall Street and manufacturing capital. And as much as various folks have talked about these options, this would really be a radical version of Trumpian policy if they went in this direction. And at the ultra extreme, right, what you would do is actually have exchange controls. Normally, those are put in place to prevent domestics from taking money out. This is how the Chinese use it for exchange controls. What this would ultimately entail is America limiting the inflow of foreign funds into American assets. It's a logical idea. It makes sense in relation to the underlying analysis of the balance of payments. It's extraordinarily radical in its implications for America's political economy. I don't think it's really got much chance of being realized.
But a tariff regime could be part of this overall strategy somehow?
Well, tariffs actually have the effect, we discussed this the other time, of actually making the dollar stronger, which is the opposite of what you want to achieve. And that in Trump circles is then cited as a reason why the really bad effects of tariffs are not going to hit American consumers, because as the dollar gets stronger for American consumers, the price of foreign goods goes down, offsetting the rise in cost due to the tariff. If that is the case, then the only people that really lose from the tariff are foreign producers who can't sell into the US. and there will be gains on the part of American producers who can occupy that space. That's the Trumpian best case. But it's the opposite of the argument that in the long run, what actually needs to happen is the dollar needs to devalue.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, is there a theory here where it could also be the tariffs themselves, again, as I sort of flagged at the beginning, or maybe some kind of economic diplomatic tool where then you kind of leverage them to convince other countries to raise the relative value of their currencies with respect to the dollar.
Well, I mean, but the problem is, so you could persuade the Chinese perhaps to end their manipulation, but right now we actually think, because of the underlying conditions in the Chinese economy and because of the desire of wealthy Chinese to get their wealth out, if the Chinese stopped intervening, the most likely effect would in fact be a devaluation of the yuan, which would further amplify the competitive pressure. So right now, China is in fact doing the world a favor in limiting the ability of its upper class to take their wealth out of the country. For political reasons, it will be a one-off effect, but it would be a wrenching shock to the currency system of all of East Asia.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break right here, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about Trump's tariffs. So to turn to the effect that the tariffs have domestically in the United States, I mean, regardless of the strategic motivations, it seems that with respect to Trump's goals, whatever they are, tariffs can only work by creating some kind of domestic disruption, right? I mean, either supply chains, need to be disrupted or prices need to rise as the birth pangs of whatever new order is trying to be created. So, what should we make of the denials or the complaints by the Trump administration about, any resulting economic pain? I mean, isn't the pain to some extent the point of the tariffs?
Yes. I think that's an absolutely clear and helpful analysis. And it's two types of pain. One is that in the new equilibrium, you want there to be redistribution, and you want to redistribute from those who benefit from the existing global setup to a new set of beneficiaries. And what you're effectively saying is you're going to take something away from American consumers. If you went down the capital controls route, we're going to take a great deal away from Wall Street, and what we're going to do is favor Americans as workers. And that will be a redistributive strategy. And the policy will only succeed if you actually bring that about. So some people will suffer pain, some people will suffer benefit. And this is the logic of structural adjustment over time and liberal economics in the 19th century, when the changes were much, much more dramatic. The things we're talking about structurally now are tiny little shifts of a few percentage points here or there, whereas in the 19th and early 20th centuries, we were talking about the deruralization of the world, right? Americans stopped being farmers, moved to the cities, took service and industrial jobs on a huge scale. And in Europe, it was even more so. And Europeans and then Asians, of course, migrated to the United States in huge numbers. So massive, convulsive, hugely complex trade-offs. And then there is also, quite aside from that, there are sunk costs in the existing system, right? So building a supply chain is expensive, it requires investment, and some of those will no longer be relevant in the new era. Like China, for instance, did a lot of work to shift its supply chains to the United States into Vietnam and Mexico. We think that has been a big driver of the Vietnam case. This is really extraordinary. Vietnam now has a larger trade surplus with the United States than Germany. And if you think that's because Vietnam did it, I think, I've got a bridge I'd like to sell you. That's clearly Chinese businesses relocating to Vietnam and using Vietnam as an export base. So if now the Trump administration moves to impose serious sanctions on Mexico, and it's a big if, that diversion strategy will have paid off for a few years, but the bluff will now be called. So yes, there's a real cost, and the administration, it's just engaging in its wishful thinking when it says no, this will be good for everyone all the time. It's silly, but all sides in democratic politics would engage in this kind of thing. But after all, the Republicans do it particularly egregiously. For instance, Besant is out there making the case for maintaining the Trump tax cut of 2017, and that was like one of the most egregiously upward or aggressive bias tax cuts in history, in the American political history. And he's making the case in terms of saying, well, if we don't do this, there'll be a disaster for the economy as a whole. And what it would be is a blow to the most affluent Americans. If you do our best guess of the math, how big are these effects? One of the things that one again and again concludes from trade modeling is that the costs and the benefits are not huge. They're real, and they will hit certain communities very hard, as in the case of the China shock. If you were in the business of making sweatshirts, you got destroyed by Chinese imports in the early 2000s. But obviously, they're a tiny part of the US economy. So it's real, it's pervasive effects, but they are incrementally relatively small unless you get into the territory of really bonkers kind of tariffs. But in certain supply chains, they will really, really disrupt them. So the North American auto industry, as it's currently set up, cannot deal with a 20%, 25% levy on trade between Mexico and Canada, because any given motor vehicle sold in the United States, all its parts cross those boundaries. The number that people quote is 8 times. So every single time they cross, they would be subject to this tariff, which would just escalate the prices in an absurd way. That supply chain can be rejigged, but if the policy was imposed immediately without any kind of concessions, it would have a paralyzing effect.
Yeah, I mean, if we were to give the Trump administration credit and assume that they understand that pain is a part of this policy, I'm curious, how we could think about what effective checks there are on this policy. Because if he's committed to the idea that there will be economic pain in the United States, and he simply wants others, namely those abroad, to suffer relatively more than, those at home, what are the ways of checking this policy? What kind of actors can play a role? And I guess first off, the question that came to mind is, can bond markets or currency markets force a change in U.S. policy when there's this kind of, kamikaze aspect to it? And as I was thinking of that, I was wondering, why hasn't there been more turmoil in those financial markets than there has been? I mean, what to make of, there's been fluctuations, but I don't think there's been chaos to the extent of forcing a change. So how should we understand that?
I think this is a really nice question. I like the way that you're, setting this up. I think there is a willingness to accept pain. Obviously, the basic promise is that ultimately tariffs will generate benefits and concentrated benefits for certain key groups. And so, economists going all the way back to Adam Smith have always argued that tariffs aren't hard to explain because interest groups whose interests are very focused and clear and apparent, and who are relatively small relative to the entirety of society, and therefore relatively easy to coordinate and bring together. You only just need to have one meeting in a smoke-filled room with dudes with cigars, and you're off to the races, right? The tariffs are easy to explain because that kind of interest group lies behind them ultimately. And the whole sort of, that when we talk about liberalism as a civilizational project and how proud it is of itself and how narcissistic, that it is that way because in part it thinks that protectionism is the historically predictable thing. And it's a civilizational achievement, a triumph of reason over narrow-minded self-interest, when we actually do the math on the whole thing and conclude that from the point of view of society as a whole, tariffs are bad. And so that's why, in Europe, it's more or less borderline illegal to advocate economic nationalism, because what you're threatening is the coherence of the EU. I mean, the same way as interstate commerce, right, is the foundation for the vast majority of federal law, right? Because Congress mandate, as far as I understand it, Edie, my law school student daughter, explains this to me. That is one thing that Congress felt it could legislate on, namely there shouldn't be undue barriers in trade between states. And so this becomes the embryo of American law in general about all sorts of things, the same way that the unity of the common market is the core of much European legislation. And so preserving this intact and its charisma, right? Its coherence as a central pillar of how we understand our common order was key, and the horror really is a horror of liberals at the sort of actions the American government are taking, is that it disrupts this and it exposes how fragile it is, and opens up the realization that, oh my God, there really isn't anything to stop. Because the trade unions will line up, the producers will line up. And by contrast, the more general interest, which is ultimately represented by the consumers, just silence. And you see this speaking to Biden people as well. It's kind of extraordinary to watch, as they'll proudly tell you that they've redefined the objective of economic policy to center on Americans as producers. And it's just like, do you understand how atavistic and regressive that move is in terms of the history of our thinking about society? Because producers are by definition smaller and more sectional groups, right? That's the... And sure, there are arguments for this. I understand what the arguments are. It's just a sort of a blindness to the underlying history of this problem. And so I think right now what's going on is, the reason why markets haven't overreacted so far is A, he's threatened a lot but hasn't done much. And B, there is just a collective kind of disbelief at what's going on, right? You don't want to believe the insanity. You don't want to believe that Washington is actually threatening its two largest national trade partners with tariffs when there is no economic case for it to be done. And really, it's hooked to fentanyl. And really, it's hooked just to the sense that Trump has to deliver something on the tariff things. And he wants to go at those two. And that's really... So there's an unwillingness just to credit the fact that he's in control, and he's surrounded by a bunch of cranks and irresponsible careerists and toadies. And yes, men, they're overwhelmingly men, who are high on their own supply and, are just right now wrecking large parts of the American government machine. And so, quite reasonably, on any given day, incredibly serious, incredibly sophisticated people who trade on wafer-thin margins in the US Treasury market don't really know how to process this, like any more than any of us do. And so the markets so far have been relatively insensitive to this. At some point, I think there could be some really dark awakenings. And we don't quite know what that looks like yet, because it's never happened in this form.
I want to clarify this. I mean, the relative, sanguineness, the relative calm on these markets is because, to some extent, the traders don't believe the darkest of the intentions that may be at work here.
Well, they don't believe, or they prefer to think that probably he'll come around to something more sensible. And that's, after all, what did happen with the Canada and Mexico tariffs. But also there is an unwillingness. There is simply a kind of Wile E. Coyote kind of moment where you're off the cliff and your legs are spinning in midair, but you're not falling yet. And, if you're in the US, if you're in the aid sector, you're falling. And there is, I think, still an underlying belief that with regard to the absolutely core elements of American financial power, Treasury, Fed, bond market, things will be different. And the relationship between tariffs and bond markets is not direct anyway. And with regard to the currency markets, which you mentioned, the more tariff, the stronger the dollar gets. So we don't have that downward spiral of a plunging dollar, rising interest rates, and collapsing bond markets. But is this, deep, fundamental questioning of the world economy as a functioning division of labor? It absolutely is. And even if it's not serious, the willingness to say these kind of things out loud and this sort of government by bully is novel and shocking. It's not the first time around with Trump, but it's definitely more aggressive and more intense this time around.
Well, then I guess I'd want to ask about the perspective from other states that are affected by these tariffs. I mean, they may have a more bracing view of this than the financial markets, given that they are actors that deal directly in these questions of power that I think you've pointed out are ultimately at work here. But then what would it mean for the rest of the world, for other states to effectively, hypothetically, but for them to cooperate against the United States and its economic power here? I mean, is it conceivable that the world could impose some kinds of export controls on the United States as a penalty? I mean, as a way, again, of coercing a change in policy? I mean, what recourse is available to the rest of the world here at all?
Well, I mean, the world could do things like Americans do, which is exactly impose export controls. There's I saw rumors on Bloomberg this morning about China limiting tungsten supplies to the world market. You could sanction individual firms. So you could go after Elon Musk, you could go after Apple, you could go after the platform businesses. The EU has talked about this. China obviously knows that those would be two very sensitive firms whose business model is heavily dependent on China they could go after. And that would simply be an analog to say what the United States has attempted to do to Huawei, the Chinese cellular network business. So you could do that. But every time you do that kind of move, right, when you attack an American business or you try and push your own exporters not to sell to the United States, the problem with demand is posed. And the fundamental reason why America has the leverage that it does over the world economy are the macro imbalances. Whether you view those through the globe's desire for American financial assets, the Pettist view, or you view it from the mercantilist industrial production side, which would be that Germany, China, or the oil exporting states, pump more production into the world than they domestically consume. And that has to be absorbed by global markets. And in those global markets, it's not one-to-one. America doesn't buy any oil from the Gulf, but America acts as a pump in the global demand system in a way that sustains the entire system. And that's the fundamental problem. And it's a good challenge. Ideally, it would be a good problem to have, right? This is the reason why Europe should be doing a debt-financed, large-scale fiscal program. And it should combine that with sanctions against the United States to offset the damage that exporters will suffer in a trade war. This is the sort of thing America does, right? When it does this protectionism, on the premise that the domestic economy is running super hot, so you can take the pain in the distributional struggle. It's not the end of the world. But that is what you would have to do. So for America's antagonists in this trade war situation, you can hurt America. It can hurt American firms which operate, the few American firms that really do operate transnationally and globally. You can limit your own exports to the United States. But if you're going to do that, you then have to ensure that this isn't ultimately just a huge loss of demand for your producers, which requires you to do an accommodating fiscal policy. And which is why people like Pettis, I think in entirely good faith, say this is going to be a wrench, but in the end, it'll be good for everyone. It's an analysis that derives from Hobson, the radical liberal from Britain. He's actually a heterodox figure. It'd be interesting to do a program about, who had this incredible and hugely influential analysis of imperialism as a distorted system in which fundamentally elite interests warped the domestic economy. And the Pettis-Klein argument in trade wars or class wars was that these imbalances are very much to the detriment of the working class in Germany and the working class in China. And so a rebalancing would be good for, arguably, in the long run, it'll be good for everyone except the capitalist elite, the finance interest in the United States and the corporate interests in Germany and China, the group that really benefit from this unequal exchange.
Just to follow up here, because I think that's a fascinating analysis. I mean, the leverage that the United States has against all others that you're describing, I mean, is that on a bilateral basis? And I guess that's what sort of motivated my question, in the sense I wonder, can the rest of the world establish its own leverage by cooperating together against the United States? And perhaps some of the demand that you're talking about as being at issue could be reestablished by lowering trade barriers among other countries.
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe this brings the conversation full circle, because we started about talking about the G20 and the United States now perhaps leaving it. I mean, could that be a forum of cooperation, of reestablishing cooperative leverage against the United States?
And above all, preventing the opposite, which is a real risk, which is that as American protectionism goes up, China diverts its exports to other markets, right? So that then the pressure there is exaggerated. But yes, that would be, and I cite the European Union because that's already there, right? All of the institutional mechanisms necessary for that cooperative policy to work are present there. But yes, there's excited talk about the Europeans and Latin America maybe moving forward on Mercosur. all sorts of, Greenland really ought to join Canada, not the United States, more or less serious suggestions. And one of the reasons ultimately, perhaps as a final observation, why the estimates of the damage that may be done by American protectionism are as modest as they are is that for several decades now, as large as these American deficits are and as important as they are on net to the overall functioning of the world economy, the major areas of growth in global trade are not across the Atlantic and not to the United States, right? The major areas of growth, which are relatively balanced, so they don't show up in the unbalanced trade analysis, are in Asia, between Asian countries. And so that's really the central dynamic. There's a sense in which this is all like, the kind of attention-grabbing show of a declining hegemon that is banging the drum and declaring itself the pot of gold and, all of this rhetoric. And, the Biden version of this was this liberal claim to leadership on all things. And it's just, I'm sorry, it's so out of date, right? It's not... The United States exits the G20. There's a scenario in which that's actually kind of good for the cooperation of that entity, right? Because so many of the antagonisms with the G20 ultimately center on America's definition of what the antagonisms ought to be. So, and I don't say that glibly, the investments of America's allies in their relationship with the United States are fundamental, existential. They shape who we are. But, this wrenching shock does open up possibilities as well.
Well, yeah, if the United States is a sideshow, it's certainly a very active and busy one. Will remain so, I'm sure, in the weeks ahead. We will end this conversation here for now, but we'll be back soon enough in your feeds. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwosePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.